Sarah McKenna pulled her worn leather coat tighter around her shoulders as the morning mist rolled across the Oregon Territory valleys. The year was 1872, and tensions between the white settlers and the Modoc tribe had reached a breaking point. She had come west with her husband, James, 3 years earlier, full of dreams about starting fresh on their own land. Now, standing on the porch of their small cabin, she watched the distant smoke signals rising from the lava beds where the Modoc had taken refuge. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wooden railing. Fear had become her constant companion since the troubles began. Every shadow in the tree line could hide a warrior. Every sound at night could signal an attack. The other settler women spoke in hushed tones about the stories they heard from Fort Klamath, about raids and battles that seemed to grow bloodier with each telling. James emerged from the barn, his face grim as he approached the house. His boots made heavy sounds on the wooden steps, and Sarah could see the worry lines that had deepened around his eyes over the past months. He carried his rifle casually, but she noticed how his finger never strayed far from the trigger guard. "The military patrol came by this morning while you were inside," he said, removing his hat and running weathered fingers through his graying hair. "Captain Jack and his people are still holding out in the lava beds. The army's planning another push to force them onto the reservation." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had heard the name Captain Jack whispered with both fear and grudging respect throughout the territory. The Modoc leader had refused repeated demands to move his people to the Klamath Reservation, where they would be forced to live alongside their traditional enemies. Instead, he had led them to the natural fortress of the lava beds, where the twisted rock formations provided perfect defensive positions. "What does that mean for us?" Sarah asked. Though she already knew the answer would bring no comfort, James set his rifle against the porch post and took her hands in his. His palms were rough from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. "It means we need to be more careful than ever. The fighting's going to get worse before it gets better." That afternoon, Sarah found herself alone when James rode out to check on their small herd of cattle grazing in the far meadow. She tried to keep busy with her daily tasks, but her mind kept wandering to the stories she had heard about the Modoc people before the troubles began. Old Tom Wilson, who ran the trading post in nearby Linkville, had told her about the time he had spent among the Modoc in peaceful years. He described them as proud people with a deep connection to their ancestral lands. The lava beds weren't just a hiding place to them, he explained. They were sacred ground where their ancestors had lived and died, where their spiritual beliefs took root in the volcanic soil. As Sarah worked in her small garden, pulling weeds from between the potato plants, she found herself thinking about the Modoc women. Were they also afraid? Did they lie awake at night worrying about their children? The newspapers and military reports always spoke of the Modoc as savage warriors, but Sarah had begun to wonder if that was the complete truth. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. She straightened quickly, her heart racing as she shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun. Relief flooded through her when she recognized the blue uniforms of a cavalry patrol, but the feeling was short-lived when she saw the serious expressions on the soldiers' faces. The patrol leader, a young lieutenant with dust covering his uniform, dismounted and approached her with respectful caution. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Morrison from Fort Klamath. Is your husband available?" "He's checking the cattle," Sarah replied, wiping her dirty hands on her apron. "Is there trouble?" "There was a skirmish yesterday near Tule Lake. A supply wagon was attacked. We're advising all settlers in this area to be extra vigilant." The lieutenant paused, as if considering his next words carefully. "Ma'am, we'd be happy to escort you and your husband to the fort until this situation is resolved." Sarah felt the familiar grip of fear tighten around her chest, but she shook her head. "This is our home, Lieutenant. We can't just abandon everything we've worked for." The soldier nodded with understanding, though concern remained in his young eyes. "I respect that, ma'am. But these aren't ordinary raiders. A Modoc know this country better than anyone, and they're fighting for something they believe in. That makes them more dangerous than usual." After the patrol departed, Sarah sat on her porch steps and allowed herself to really examine the fear that had been growing inside her. It wasn't just fear of violence or death, she realized. It was fear of the unknown, fear of people she had never really tried to understand. The Modoc had become faceless enemies in her mind, shaped by rumors and military reports rather than any real knowledge. That evening, when James returned home, she shared her conversation with the lieutenant. They sat together on their small porch, watching the sun set over the distant mountains where the Modoc were making their stand. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and red, and for a moment the beauty of the land made the conflict seem impossibly distant. "James," Sarah said softly. "Do you think we really understand what we're fighting about?" Her husband was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "I think we're all fighting for the same thing, in a way," he finally replied. "The right to live on the land we call home." "But whose home is it really?" Sarah asked. The question hung in the air between them like the evening mist. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A neighbor, Pete Dawson, arrived at their cabin before sunrise with word that a Modoc woman had been found near the settlement, badly injured and alone. She had been taken to the doctor's house in town, but no one knew what to do with her. "She keeps asking for something," Dawson explained. "Doc Williams thinks she's asking for help, but none of us speak their language. The military wants to question her, but she's in no condition for that." Sarah felt something stir inside her, a feeling she couldn't quite name. What will happen to her? "Hard to say," Dawson replied with a shrug. "The army might use her to try to get a message to Captain Jack, assuming she knows anything useful. Or they might just send her up to the reservation once she's healed." All day, Sarah found herself thinking about the injured Modoc woman. She imagined her lying in the doctor's house, surrounded by strangers speaking a language she didn't understand, probably terrified and in pain. The image haunted Sarah as she went about her daily tasks. That evening, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She told James she wanted to go to town to see the woman. Her husband looked at her as if she had suggested walking into the lava beds unarmed. "Sarah, that's not a good idea," he said gently. "The whole town's on edge. People are scared and angry. They might not appreciate you showing kindness to someone they see as the enemy." "But she's hurt," Sarah replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "She's just a woman, like me. If I were lying injured in a Modoc camp, wouldn't I want someone to show me kindness?" James studied his wife's face in the lamplight and saw a determination he hadn't noticed before. "What exactly are you planning to do?" Sarah wasn't entirely sure herself, but she knew she had to try something. "I want to sit with her. Maybe bring her some food, some comfort. I don't know if it will help, but I have to try." The next morning, despite James's continued worries, Sarah hitched up their wagon and made the journey to town. The doctor's house sat on the main street, and she could see curtains twitching in windows as curious neighbors watched her arrival. Word traveled fast in small settlements, and she knew her visit would be the subject of much gossip. Williams greeted her at the door with surprise and some concern. He was a kind man who had treated everyone in the community regardless of their ability to pay, but even he seemed uncertain about the current situation. "Mrs. McKenna, I'm not sure this is wise," he said in low tones. "The woman is recovering from a gunshot wound and severe exhaustion. She's been through a terrible ordeal." "That's exactly why I want to help," Sarah replied. "May I see her?" The doctor led her to a small room at the back of his house. The Modoc woman lay on a narrow bed, her dark hair spread across the white pillow. She was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps in her 20s, with a face that would have been beautiful if not marked by pain and fear. When the woman's eyes opened and saw Sarah, she tensed visibly. Sarah moved slowly, keeping her hands visible, and sat in the chair beside the bed. For long moments they simply looked at each other, two women from different worlds connected by their shared humanity. Sarah began to speak softly, not expecting to be understood, but hoping her tone would convey her peaceful intentions. She talked about the weather, about her garden, about anything that seemed harmless. Gradually, she noticed the tension leave the woman's shoulders. When Sarah reached into a basket and produced some fresh bread and preserves, the woman's eyes widened with surprise. Sarah broke off a piece of bread and ate it first, showing it was safe, then offered some to her patient. The simple act of sharing food seemed to bridge the gap between their different languages and cultures. As the days passed, Sarah returned regularly to sit with the recovering woman. She learned that her name was Winona, and that she had been separated from her family during a military patrol. Through gestures and simple drawings, they began to communicate about their lives, their families, their fears. Winona showed Sarah a small beaded necklace she wore, pointing to herself and then to the mountains where her people lived. Her eyes filled with tears as she touched the beads, and Sarah understood she was homesick and worried about her loved ones. In return, Sarah shared stories about her own journey west, about leaving her family behind in Missouri to build a new life with James. She showed Winona the simple wedding ring she wore and the small daguerreotype of her parents that she carried in her pocket. Through these quiet exchanges, Sarah began to see the Modoc not as faceless enemies but as people with the same hopes and fears as herself. She realized that her terror had been fed by ignorance in the stories of others, rather than any real knowledge of the people she had been taught to fear. One afternoon, as Winona grew stronger, she managed to speak a few words of English she had learned from traders in better times. "Thank you," she said simply, but her eyes conveyed much more. Sarah felt tears prick her own eyes as she realized how much this simple human connection had meant to both of them. For the first time since coming to Oregon, she felt she was seeing clearly, beyond the fear and prejudice that had clouded her vision. But she also knew that admitting her fear and the ignorance behind it was only the beginning. The real test would come in what she chose to do with this new understanding. Word of Sarah's visits to the injured Modoc woman spread through the settlement like wildfire. By the end of the week, she could feel the disapproving stares of her neighbors whenever she walked down the main street. Conversation stopped when she entered the general store, and former friends crossed to the other side of the road to avoid speaking with her. Martha Henley, the preacher's wife, finally confronted Sarah outside the doctor's house on a particularly tense Thursday morning. "Sarah McKenna, what do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp with righteous indignation. "That woman's people have been attacking our settlements." Her own kinfolk might have killed good Christian folks. Sarah paused, her hand on the doctor's gate. She had been expecting this confrontation, but it still made her heart race. "She's hurt and alone, Martha, just trying to show some Christian charity." "Christian charity?" Martha's face reddened. "There's nothing Christian about consorting with savages. You're putting all of us at risk with your foolishness."
Other women had gathered, drawn by the raised voices. Sarah saw fear and anger in their faces, but she also saw something else she was beginning to recognize.
The same ignorance and prejudice she had carried in her own heart just weeks before. "Have any of you actually spoken to a Modoc person?" Sarah asked quietly. "Do any of you know what they're really fighting for?" The question created uncomfortable silence. Finally, Mrs. Henderson, an older woman who had lost her son to illness the previous winter, spoke up. "We know they're trying to drive us from our homes." "That's enough. But what if these are their homes too?" Sarah replied. "What if they're fighting for the same thing we are? The right to live on the land they love?" The crowd began to murmur angrily, but Sarah continued. "I've been sitting with Winona for over a week now. She has children, just like some of you. She worries about her family, just like all of us. She cries when she's in pain, and she's grateful for kindness. She's not so different from us." Martha Henley stepped forward, her voice cold. "You've named her now, as if she were your friend?" "Maybe she is," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. That evening, James waited for her on their porch, his face grave. "Sarah, I've been hearing talk in town. Some of the men are saying you've lost your mind. Others are suggesting worse things." Sarah sat beside her husband, suddenly feeling very tired. "And what do you think?" James was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sky. "I think you've found courage. I didn't know you had. But I also think you're walking into danger, and not just from the Modoc." "James, I have to tell you something," Sarah said, taking his weathered hand in hers. "When I first heard about the troubles with the Modoc, I was terrified, not just of being hurt or killed, but of something I didn't understand. I realized that my fear was making me hate people I'd never even met." She told him about her conversations with Winona, about the drawings they had shared and the stories they had managed to communicate despite their different languages. She described the moment she realized that the Modoc woman's tears over her missing family looked exactly like her own tears when she missed her parents back in Missouri. "I'm not saying there isn't real danger," Sarah continued. "People are dying on both sides, but I think we've been so busy being afraid of each other that we've forgotten to ask why we're fighting." The next day brought news that changed everything. A rider from Fort Klamath arrived with word that the military was planning a major offensive against the Modoc stronghold in the lava beds. General Canby himself was coming to oversee the operation, and they expected the final battle to begin within days. Dr. Williams sought out Sarah that morning, his face troubled. "Mrs. McKenna, the Army is demanding that I turn the woman over to them. They want to use her as a messenger to Captain Jack, to demand his surrender." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had come to understand that Winona was likely from a group that had been trying to avoid the fighting altogether, caught in the wrong place when the patrol found them. Using her as a messenger would put her directly in the middle of the conflict. "What did you tell them?" Sarah asked. "I told them she's still too weak to travel," the doctor replied. "But that won't hold them off for long. They're determined to end this war one way or another." That afternoon, Sarah made perhaps the most dangerous decision of her life. She asked Dr. Patprick, Williams if she could spend the night at his house, ostensibly to help care for Winona during a difficult phase of her recovery. What she really planned was much more dangerous. In the early hours before dawn, Sarah gently woke Winona and helped her dress in some of Sarah's own clothes. The Modoc woman was still weak, but she could walk with assistance. Through whispered words and gestures, Sarah made her understand that they were leaving. They slipped out the back door of the doctor's house and made their way through the dark streets to where Sarah had hidden her wagon. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential witness. Every sound threatened to expose their escape. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she was sure it could be heard blocks away. Ah! Once they were clear of town, Winona began to understand where they were going. She shook her head vigorously, pointing back toward the settlement, and then toward herself. Through their limited shared vocabulary, she seemed to be saying that Sarah was putting herself in danger. "I know," Sarah replied softly, "but it's the right thing to do." The journey to the edge of Modoc territory took most of the morning. Sarah had never been this far from the settlement alone, and every mile took her deeper into unknown country. The landscape grew wilder, with twisted lava formations creating strange shapes against the sky. When they finally reached the area where Sarah believed Modoc scouts might find them, she stopped the wagon. Winona was looking around with recognition, her eyes bright for the first time since Sarah had met her. This was her homeland, the country she had been trying to return to. They sat together in the wagon, waiting. Sarah had no idea if her plan would work, or if she would even survive the next few hours. She had acted on pure instinct, driven by a conviction that showing trust might be the first step toward ending the cycle of fear and violence. The sun was high overhead when the first Modoc warrior appeared, seeming to materialize from the rocky landscape like a spirit. He was followed by others, all armed and painted for war. Sarah felt her old fear return, but she forced herself to remain calm. Winona called out in her own language, and Sarah could hear the joy and relief in her voice. One of the warriors approached the wagon, his rifle ready but not directly threatening. He spoke rapidly to Winona, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. After what seemed like an eternity, Winona turned to Sarah and spoke in her careful English. "He asks why you helped me." Sarah looked directly at the warrior, hoping her sincerity would translate across the language barrier. "Because she needed help. Because she's a mother and a daughter, just like me." The translation seemed to have an effect. The warrior's expression softened slightly, though he remained alert. He spoke again, and Winona translated. "He says his people have heard of the white woman who sits with the sick one. He asks if you are afraid." Sarah considered lying, but something about the moment demanded complete honesty. "Yes, I'm very afraid, but I'm more afraid of what happens if we keep hating each other without trying to understand why." The conversation that followed was halting and difficult, conducted through Winona's translation and supplemented with gestures and drawings in the dusty ground. But gradually, Sarah began to understand the Modoc perspective on the conflict. They weren't fighting to drive out all white settlers as she had been told. They were fighting for the right to remain on their ancestral lands, the places where their fathers and grandfathers were buried. The government wanted to force them onto a reservation with the Klamath tribe, their traditional enemies. To the Modoc, this was like asking them to live in the homes of people who had murdered their families. Captain Jack, their leader, had tried to find peaceful solutions. He had met with government officials multiple times, always asking for the same thing: a small reservation on their own land where his people could live in peace. But the officials always said no, always demanded complete surrender and relocation. "So they fight," Winona explained, her voice sad. "Not because they want war, but because they have no other choice." As the afternoon wore on, more Modoc appeared. Sarah realized she was in the presence of a war council, men who made life and death decisions for their people. They debated among themselves in their own language, occasionally glancing at her with expressions she couldn't read. Finally, an older man approached the wagon. He wore the regalia of a chief or important leader, and his weathered face spoke of many years of difficult decisions. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "He is my uncle," Winona translated. "He says you have shown great courage to come here. He asks what message you bring from your people." Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She was just a farmer's wife, not a diplomat or military officer, but somehow she had become a bridge between two groups of people who had forgotten how to see each other as human. "I bring no official message," she said carefully. "I can only speak for myself. But I want to tell him that not all white settlers are his enemies. Some of us want to find a way to live together in peace. The translation sparked another round of discussion among the Modoc leaders. Sarah caught glimpses of the debate through their gestures and tone. Some voices seemed angry, others thoughtful, still others resigned. When the older man spoke again, his words carried the weight of years of disappointment. Through Winona, he explained that his people had tried to trust white promises before. Treaties had been made and broken. Agreements had been reached and then ignored when they became inconvenient for the government.
He says the white chief in Washington speaks with two tongues, Winona translated. One tongue promises peace, the other sends soldiers.
Sarah felt the truth of the accusation, even though she had no power to change it. I know my people have broken faith before. I can't change that. But I can promise that not all of us are the same. Some of us want to find a better way. As the sun began to set, Sarah knew she had to leave. Staying too long would raise suspicions back at the settlement and might put both herself and her new Modoc friends in greater danger. But before she left, the older chief spoke once more. His words were formal, ceremonial. Through Winona, he told Sarah that she had shown honor by risking her own safety to help someone in need. In Modoc culture, such actions created bonds that could not be easily broken. He says you will always be welcome among our people, Winona translated. But he also warns that dark times are coming. The soldiers are gathering for a big fight. Many will die on both sides. As Sarah prepared to leave, Winona pressed something into her hand. A small beaded bracelet, similar to the necklace she always wore. So you remember, she said in her careful English. The journey back to the settlement seemed to take forever. Sarah's mind raced with everything she had learned, everything she had seen. She had gone seeking to return an injured woman to her people, but she had found something much more important, the beginning of understanding. But she also knew that understanding alone would not be enough to prevent the tragedy that seemed to be approaching. The military was determined to end the conflict with force, and the Modoc were equally determined to defend their homeland. Her small act of courage had opened a window between two worlds, but the forces of war were already in motion. As she finally reached her own cabin, where James waited with obvious relief, Sarah realized that admitting her fear had been only the first step. Now she faced an even greater challenge, finding the courage to act on what she had learned, even when it meant standing against the tide of popular opinion and military authority. The military tribunal convened 3 days after Sarah returned from Modoc territory. Word of her unauthorized mission had reached the commanding officer at Fort Klamath, and she found herself summoned to answer for what the army considered an act of treason. James rode beside her toward the fort, his jaws set with determination to stand by his wife regardless of the consequences. Colonel Wheaton, a career officer with steel grey hair and unforgiving eyes, presided over the hearing. The small room was crowded with military personnel and civilian officials, all eager to see how the army would handle this unprecedented situation. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair, the beaded bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve, feeling the weight of dozens of hostile stares. "McKenna," the colonel began, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command, "you stand accused of providing aid and comfort to hostile Indians during wartime. You willfully transported an enemy combatant to safety and made unauthorized contact with Modoc war leaders. How do you answer these charges?" Sarah felt her mouth go dry, but she forced herself to stand and speak clearly. "Colonel, I helped an injured woman return to her family. I don't see that as treason. I see it as Christian duty." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the room. Colonel Wheaton raised his hand for silence. "Mrs. McKenna, these people are not simply another family. They are hostile Indians who have killed American soldiers and civilians. Your actions could be seen as encouraging their resistance." "Sir, with respect," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger, "I think we need to understand why they're resisting. The Modoc I met weren't bloodthirsty savages. They're people defending their homeland." The statement created an uproar in the small room. Several officers began speaking at once, their voices raised in anger and disbelief. Colonel Wheaton pounded his gavel repeatedly, his face reddening with frustration. "Mrs. McKenna, you are clearly suffering from some form of hysteria brought on by your ordeal," he said when order was finally restored. No rational person could sympathize with these hostiles after witnessing their depredations. But Sarah had found her voice now, and the fear that had controlled her for so long was being replaced by something stronger, a deep conviction that the truth needed to be told, regardless of the consequences. Colonel, I was terrified of the Modoc for months before I actually met any of them. My fear was based on stories and rumors, not on any real knowledge. When I finally sat with Winona and learned to see her as a person instead of an enemy, everything changed. She told the tribunal about her conversations with the Modoc leaders, about their desire for a small reservation on their ancestral lands, about their repeated attempts to find peaceful solutions. She described the pain in the old chief's eyes when he spoke of broken treaties and empty promises from Washington. These people aren't fighting because they hate us, Sarah continued. They're fighting because they have nowhere else to go. We're asking them to give up everything that makes them who they are. Captain Morrison, the young lieutenant who had visited her farm weeks earlier, stood up from the back of the room. Ma'am, I respect your compassion, but you don't understand the military situation. Captain Jack's band has fortified positions in the lava beds that make them nearly impossible to dislodge. They've already cost us dozens of casualties. We can't simply let them dictate terms. But what if there's another way? Sarah asked. What if we actually listened to what they're asking for? A small piece of land that means everything to them but little to us? Colonel Wheaton's patience had clearly reached its limit. Mrs. McKenna, military policy is not made by farm wives who fancy themselves diplomats. You have interfered with official government business and endangered the lives of soldiers under my command. Before he could continue, the door to the tribunal room opened and a dusty messenger entered. He whispered urgently to one of the officers, who then approached the colonel. After a brief, quiet conversation, Colonel Wheaton's expression changed dramatically. Gentlemen, he announced to the room, I have just received word that General Canby has been murdered during peace negotiations with Captain Jack. The General and Reverend Thomas were killed yesterday while meeting with Modoc leaders under a flag of truce. The room erupted in chaos. Officers shouted for immediate retaliation. Civilians demanded the complete destruction of the Modoc band, and several men called for Sarah to be charged as an accomplice to murder. In the midst of the tumult, Sarah felt her heart breaking for everyone involved. To the dead general and minister, to the Modoc people who would now face the full fury of military vengeance, and for any hope of peaceful resolution. When order was finally restored, Colonel Wheaton's voice was cold as winter iron. Mrs. McKenna, your Modoc friends have shown their true nature. General Canby was one of the finest officers in the army, a man who genuinely sought peaceful solutions. His murder under a flag of truce proves that these people cannot be reasoned with. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks, but she refused to back down. Colonel, I don't know what happened at that meeting, but I know the people I met wanted peace. Something went terribly wrong, but that doesn't mean we should abandon all hope of understanding. Understanding? The colonel's voice rose with indignation. They murdered a general of the United States Army during peace talks. There will be no more talk of understanding or compromise. This rebellion ends now with complete surrender or complete destruction. The tribunal was suspended while the military prepared for what everyone knew would be the final campaign against the Modoc. Sarah was placed under house arrest at the fort, officially for her own protection, but clearly to prevent any further unauthorized contact with the enemy. During the long days of waiting, Sarah was allowed visits from James and from Reverend Palmer, the fort chaplain. Both men tried to convince her to repudiate her earlier statements and distance herself from the Modoc cause, but Sarah found herself unable to abandon the convictions she had discovered. Sarah, James pleaded during one particularly difficult conversation, they killed General Canby in cold blood. How can you still defend them? I'm not defending murder, Sarah replied wearily, but I can't forget what I saw in that old chief's eyes, or the way Winona cried when she talked about her children. Good people can do terrible things when they're desperate and afraid. Reverend Palmer took a different approach, appealing to Sarah's Christian beliefs. Mrs. McKenna, surely you can see that God's will is for civilization to triumph over savagery. These people reject the gospel and cling to heathen ways. But Sarah had been thinking deeply about her faith during her confinement. Reverend, didn't Christ tell us to love our enemies, to show mercy to those who are different from us? I think I've been more Christian in the last month than in all the years before, when I let fear turn me against people I'd never even met. The final assault on the Modoc stronghold began in late April. From her window at the fort, Sarah could see the supply wagons heading out toward the lava beds, loaded with ammunition and medical supplies for what everyone expected to be a costly battle. The wives of soldiers gathered in small groups, their faces tight with worry. while children played war games in the dusty parade ground. But the battle, when it came, was shorter and more decisive than anyone had anticipated. The Modoc resistance had been broken by months of siege and the loss of several key leaders who had opposed Captain Jack's decision to kill General Canby. When the final assault came, most of the warriors surrendered rather than fight to the death. Captain Jack himself was captured along with several other leaders. They were brought to Fort Klamath in chains, and Sarah watched from her window as the wagon carrying them passed beneath her prison room. The proud leader she had heard so much about looked exhausted and defeated, his clothes torn and his spirit clearly broken. The military tribunal reconvened to decide Sarah's fate, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. With the Modoc War effectively over, civilian authorities were eager to minimize any actions that might reflect poorly on the territorial government. Colonel Wheaton, now focused on the trials of the captured Modoc leaders, had little interest in pursuing charges against a settler woman whose crime had been excessive compassion. "Mrs. McKenna," he said when she was brought before him again, "in light of recent events and your husband's exemplary record as a settler, we are prepared to release you with a formal reprimand. However, you will sign a statement acknowledging that your actions were misguided and could have endangered military operations." Sarah looked at the document placed before her, then at James, who nodded encouragingly from his seat behind her. She picked up the pen, held it for a long moment, then set it down again. "Colonel, I can't sign this," she said quietly. "I can't say that helping an injured woman was wrong, or that trying to understand my neighbors was misguided." The room fell silent. Colonel Wheaton leaned forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "Mrs. McKenna, I am offering you freedom and a chance to return to your normal life. Why would you refuse?" Sarah stood up, feeling calmer than she had in months. "Because signing that paper would be a lie. I'm not sorry for showing kindness to Winona. I'm not sorry for learning that the Modoc are human beings with the same hopes and fears as the rest of us. I'm sorry that General Canby was killed, and I'm sorry that so many people had to die on both sides. But I'm not sorry for admitting my fear and choosing understanding over hatred." The silence stretched for what seemed like hours. Finally, Colonel Wheaton spoke with grudging respect in his voice. "McKenna, you are either the bravest woman I have ever met or the most foolish. Perhaps both." He dismissed the charges without requiring her signature, noting officially that she had been misguided by feminine sensibilities during a time of great stress. It was a face-saving formula that allowed everyone to move forward without admitting any fundamental mistakes had been made. But Sarah knew that her real trial was just beginning. When she and James returned to their cabin, they found their neighbors divided in their reactions. Some viewed her as a traitor who had aided the enemy during wartime. Others saw her as a woman who had shown Christian charity to someone in need. A few quietly told her they admired her courage, even if they disagreed with her actions. Martha Henley crossed the street to avoid speaking to her, but old Tom Wilson from the trading post sought her out specifically. "Sarah," he said, "I heard about what you did for that Modoc woman. It took real courage to follow your conscience when everyone else was running scared." The beaded bracelet Winona had given her became both a treasured possession and a constant reminder of the price of understanding. Sarah wore it hidden beneath her sleeve, a private symbol of the moment when she had chosen to see beyond her fear to the humanity of supposed enemies. Years later, when historians wrote about the Modoc War, they would focus on the military campaigns and the execution of Captain Jack and his fellow leaders. Few would mention the small acts of courage by ordinary people who tried to bridge the gap between two worlds in conflict. But Sarah remembered everything. The fear that had once controlled her, the moment she chose to see past that fear, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had acted according to her deepest convictions rather than the expectations of others. She had learned that admitting fear was not a sign of weakness, but the first step toward finding the courage to do what was right. In the end, the Modoc chose honor over pride by refusing to abandon their ancestral lands, even when it meant certain defeat. Sarah chose honor over fear by refusing to abandon her convictions, even when it meant standing alone. Both choices came with terrible costs, but both represented something essential about the human spirit that no amount of military force or social pressure could completely destroy. The Oregon Territory eventually became a state, and new settlers arrived to farm the land where the Modoc had once lived. But in one small cabin, a woman kept a beaded bracelet as a reminder that understanding could triumph over fear, that courage could emerge from the admission of weakness, and that choosing honor over comfort was always possible, Even in the darkest of times,